Hello, this is Kevin Annett. I'm speaking to you from the Republic of Canada, formerly the territory of the Dominion of Canada. It's June the 9th, 2015. Well, this last week, the Canadian government admitted that it committed genocide against Indigenous nations for over a century, and it caused the death of thousands of children in its so-called Indian residential schools, along with the Catholic, Anglican, and United Churches. Now, they're admitting what we've been saying for over 15 years, and which results in the fact that the Canadian government and its churches are now nullified as lawful authorities under international law. Hence, the Republic of Canada is waiting in the wings. My commentary today is called "Canada Evades Its Genocidal Legacy to Mask Its Ongoing Crimes. When the killers conduct the autopsy, don't expect the truth." Whenever the winners of a war write its official history and pronounce absolution on themselves, the results are both tragic and comic. Canada demonstrated that in spades this past week when its government-run Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, released its official report on the homegrown church and state slaughter of thousands of Native children in the so-called Indian residential school system. Despite the rapturous attention the TRC report received in the global media, it said nothing that we didn't already know and that I personally didn't broadcast to a deaf world as far back as June of 1998. What the TRC report did do was to cast a thick veil around Canada's crimes of the past in order to protect its crimes of the present, including institutionalized child trafficking. To the uninformed, and to those who somehow consider it legitimate for criminals to investigate themselves, it's a convincing enough veil. All the right words were used in the TRC report, concealed, of course, by horror-softening adjectives. An antiseptic term like cultural genocide becomes a substitute for the truth of tortured bodies, sterilized genitals, and violated and torn little children tossed into mass graves in the middle of the night. Can 50,000 dead innocents really constitute simply a cultural extermination? Besides, regardless of its beguiling doublespeak and outright lies, the TRC report could hardly have unearthed any type of truth about crimes in the residential schools when the primary perpetrators of those crimes, the Catholic, Anglican, and United Churches of Canada, were given years to destroy incriminating evidence, trash or hide documents, silence eyewitnesses, and obliterate the grave sites that are stuffed with their young victims. 28 such sites that we documented across Canada. Any judge that allowed a suspected killer to do such a thing would obviously be charged with aiding and abetting a crime and be removed from his office. But that's precisely what the TRC did. The TRC, whose directors were in fact nominated by these same churches, the TRC allowed these churches and government to get away with that kind of destruction of evidence. And what even the media called the circus-like atmosphere at the TRC forums, any residential school survivor who wished to speak had to submit their statement to the TRC officers first for screening and censoring before they could make the statement. Then they got a whopping 10 minutes to make that statement and talk about the horror they went through in these death camps. Yet, the church officials who showed up in order to spout their "we're only trying to do good" propaganda had no such time restrictions placed on them. One Cowichan Native woman in Victoria, BC, who went to a TRC forum said to me afterwards, quote, "It was disgusting, like sitting in the same room with my rapist and having to go through it all over again." Well, even worse, whenever survivors mentioned the names of their torturers or a suspected criminal or anyone who they saw killing children, that information was carefully stricken from the TRC transcripts. That fact alone goes far to disqualify the TRC from any claims at being legitimate or somehow legal, something the global media seem to be ignoring. "How can all this crap produce anything but a total whitewash of our genocide?" bemoaned Squamish Chief Jerry Capilano to me soon after the TRC forum in Vancouver. Well, that's exactly it. A whitewash is precisely what the TRC report produced after 7 years and $70 million. But if one can stomach sifting through its hundreds of politically correct, lawyer-crafted pages, much of which is distraction and padding, the ultimate strategy of the report does emerge, and that is to minimize the total dead body count at the residential schools so as to prove that the genocide wasn't intentional. For if there's no intention, there's no crime under the law. Well, half the children dead is clearly deliberate genocide, and all the records point to that 50% death record, whereas 1/10 of the children dead is simply negligence. And so the TRC spin machine went to work to convince all of us that rather than the figure of 50,000 and more dead children, yielded by a simple calculation of that constant 40 to 50% death rate over many decades, instead, the TRC said only 4,000 or 5,000 children actually died, which is a strange claim to make because they also claim they don't have any access to any records after 1920. So how can they know? But even 4,000 or 5,000 children is a pretty low figure, and when you spread it out over 100 residential schools over a century, that means, get this, according to the TRC, only 50 children died in the entire system every year. In other words, 1 death for every second school. Now that's nonsense because it's total Holocaust denial. We know from the records that it was routinely reported that dozens, sometimes over 100 children would die in a residential school in 1 year, especially in the West. Well, given such bald-faced deception, it's hardly surprising that the TRC chairman, a corpulent puppet Indian named Murray Sinclair, recently issued the lie that the Canadian government stopped publishing residential school death records in 1920. Well, that's an outright lie because time and again I found and published such government death records in residential schools that span the years 1889 to 1969, and I've even sent copies of these to the TRC and Sinclair. If the intent of these schools wasn't genocidal, then why did that enormous death rate of 40 to 60% never subside decade after decade? And why was it present the very first year the Western residential schools opened in 1889? All of this information is up online at itccs.org. But these two questions is something that neither the TRC nor anyone in Parliament or the media or the universities in Canada has ever bothered to question or even address. And any more than they're willing to search for any of those children buried in the mass graves that we've documented across Canada in their former residential schools. Because if they started to ask those questions and look into those bodies, it would point to a simple fact that Canada and its churches deliberately exterminated tens of thousands of children as part of a deliberate depopulation program to get the lands and resources, and that this genocide machine has never been turned off. The massive trafficking and torture of Aboriginal children today through the government child care and foster care system, the continual murder of reserve Indians to get their lands and resources, and the Agenda 21 plan of depopulating Indigenous nations around the world and in Canada to about 1/10 of their present levels by mid-century, all of these are indicators of the ongoing genocide in Canada that the TRC has actively concealed, a concealment which itself is a crime. Well, fortunately, there's a little matter called international law, which has, ever since the Nuremberg judgments, has clearly said that citizens under a proven criminal regime like Canada are not only obligated, but required not to pay taxes and not to obey its laws. Such a regime, in fact, has lost its right to govern, and it must be replaced by a new political arrangement that is lawful and that reflects the will of the people. And that republic, of course, was lawfully established in Canada last January 15th under a new common law jurisdiction. And you can see that at canadarepublic.ca. But the TRC was more than damage control. The very survival of the corporate redundancy called the Crown of England is at stake, especially now that patriots in Canada have proclaimed the Republic. Rather than the neat resolution hoped for by its blood-soaked creators, the TRC has unwittingly opened the door to the disestablishment of Canada and its churches and its government as convicted criminal actors. And they've done that by confirming that, yes, indeed, thousands of children deliberately died at their hands. None of us are compelled to obey and cooperate with genocidal institutions, and indeed to do so is to collude in a crime against humanity. Amidst a similar revolution against the British Crown and its tyranny in 1778, Thomas Paine observed that regimes that are collapsing tend to make decisions that are increasingly suicidal, as if seeking out their own destruction. Christian Canada and its sponsors in London and Rome have borne out this axiom. The only question now is whether we, the people of Canada, will take advantage of such an historic opportunity and cleanse our country once and for all of its legacy of institutionalized mass murder. Thank you.